Hi, boys and girls. It's time for another story today, and our story is called Found Treasure. Well, Samuel Jackman, up to this time, he'd had a really good life. He was 12 years old, and his family, they lived in the parsonage, which was a big white house next to the church, because their father was the pastor of that local church. That's where the trouble started. It had been good all Samuel's 12 years, but now the major trouble started. Pastor Jackman had been up in the pulpit preaching his sermon for the week when, right in the middle of it, while he was talking, suddenly he fainted away. He fell right on the floor behind the pulpit. Well, the local doctor, Dr. Klug, he rushed up and he felt the pastor's pulse. He put his head down on his chest and he listened to his heart. And he said, "I think you're just overworked." Well, that was probably the truth, because it was springtime. And the pastor, not only did he run the church and preach every weekend, in the spring, he hired out to farmers and he would work helping plant the crops, helping plow the fields. He did that because the salary that the church paid him was very small. They did give him the big parsonage to live in, and it had a big place for a garden, and it had an orchard that they could have the fruit off of, and it had raspberry bushes. And down across the road through the woods was a wonderful creek that all the kids in that community played in. It was a wonderful place. It was full of frogs and clamshells. And almost every day, Samuel, when he would come home from the school, would carry a clamshell home, and he would give it to his littlest brother. There were 6 of those boys. But Samuel only had to bring one home to the little brother because all the other kids in the family were big enough to get their own. Well, because there was so little money, they didn't have money for toys. So those clamshells from out of that shallow creek became their toys. Well, if you were to walk across that creek on the stones, you would find a path that went to an old brick country school. And that's where Samuel and his family of brothers, they all went to school there. Well, beyond that was what they would consider the little town. It had just a few small places. It had a hardware store that half of it was the grocery store. And there was a little jeweler's shop. There also was one other building, and that was the whole town. The pastor, for the next 2 weeks, he laid at home in his bed, trying to get stronger and to get well so he could preach again. Well, after those 2 weeks and the medicine that the doctor had given him, he seemed better. And all the people at the church had been praying for their pastor. They were glad to see that he was up and around again. So that weekend, he preached again. But it wasn't too many weekends later that the pastor was up behind that pulpit getting ready to preach his sermon again, when all of a sudden he became cold and clammy, and he couldn't breathe right, and he got white, and he passed out again. Well, he was brought home to the parsonage, and weeks went by, and he just wasn't getting any better. Those people at the church council decided, we feel bad about it, but we don't know what to do. We're going to have to get another pastor. Well, that meant that the Jackman family would have to move out of the parsonage. And the church said, well, we'll give you a month to find another place to live. Well, when the doctor came to see Mr. Jackman, he said, I think you just need rest. Maybe you could rent a little farm, or you could buy a little farm. And then maybe with the rest, you'd be okay again. Well, that was a wonderful suggestion, but paying rent cost money, and buying cost even more than that. They didn't know what to do. They had no money. With 6 kids, everything they had either went for food or clothes or shoes. Not extra things, just necessities. Well, they looked around. They did find a small little farm, but no money to buy it. Well, the children all prayed. The pastor and his wife prayed. Everybody in the community prayed that they would find a way to buy a place or rent a place that they could live at. And the Jackman children, they prayed to God every day. Please send some sort of a miracle. Please. Well, one morning, out behind the parsonage, there was a tiny little barn, and their cow lived in the barn. Since Father was sick, Samuel, he would go out twice a day and milk the cow. Well, it was like the cow could sense that something was wrong, too. And the cow didn't want to let her milk down. Well, unless you've been on a farm and dealt with cows, you wouldn't know what that meant. But cows, have a big bag under them that the milk forms in, and people are able to milk them and milk it out. But if the cow is upset or distressed, then the milk won't come out. Well, it took a long time for Samuel to finally get the milk out of the cow. And he was late for school. His brothers had all already gone. Well, his mother had given him a big jug, a big glass jug, and she said, I want you to stop at the grocery store, and I want you to get this filled. In those days, you just brought your own jug and they filled it with whatever. Well, Samuel, he was carrying that big jug, and he was running as fast as he could, because being late for school was not a good thing. As he ran through that little woods. Over in the distance, he could see the alfalfa fields and the wheat fields. But he didn't have time to think about that today. He was running and running and running and running and running. Well, when he hit that creek, he didn't stop, and his feet went splash, 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 splash through the water of the creek, and water went flying everywhere. Well, that wasn't all that went flying. All the frogs that like to sit in the sunshine in that creek started jumping like this out of that creek. Well, as he was splashing through, kind of trying not to step on any of those frogs, he saw something that was kind of shiny. Well, like I said, the kids were always picking up stuff out of the creek to play with. And even though he was in a hurry, he reached down and he picked it up and he put it in his hand, and it kind of looked like a small marble. Well, he stuffed it in his pocket and he ran on to all the rest of the way to school. When he got there, he could hardly breathe. And he rushed inside, and the teacher looked at him and said, "You're late." But he had a good reason for being late. Everybody understood when the cow wouldn't let their milk down, and they knew that the pastor was sick and he couldn't help. Well, at recess time, Samuel had stuck his hand in his pocket and he remembered that little round white pebble. And he took it out and he said, "I have a new pebble. Mine's prettier than you guys's." And everybody looked at it, and it was, when it was in the sunshine, sometimes it looked like it turned kind of different colors. And it was kind of purplish, and then it was white, and it was shiny. Well, recess didn't last very long. And the boys, they liked to take the pebbles. They all came from poor families. The pebbles that they stuck in their pockets when they went and played in the creek. They would get down in the grass and they pretended that they were doing battle, and they would hit each other's pebbles against each other, and they would sit them down and roll them through the grass. They would put them in lines and make them like armies. But everybody seemed to know that Samuel's new pebble was something very special. Well, school was out, and Samuel, he took that jug and he went over to that hardware grocery store. And inside, behind the counter, was the grocer. On top of that counter was a piece of flat glass. Well, while Samuel waited for the grocer to pour vinegar in that jug, he took out his pebble and he started rolling it around just like any little boy would do. And he was having a good time just rolling it here and there up on that counter. When the jeweler from down the street, he came in, he wanted a loaf of bread. Well, he told the grocer at the counter that he needed the bread, but he had to wait for him to finish filling up Samuel's jug of vinegar. Well, he was standing there and he was watching Samuel move that little round, very round pebble across the glass. Suddenly, the jeweler said, "Wait a minute, Samuel, can I look at that?" He kept looking down there at the counter. Samuel picked it up in his hand and he said, "Yeah, it's right here." And the man's eyes got big. He looked at it and he said, "Samuel, where did you get that?" Samuel wasn't worried. He hadn't done anything wrong. He said, "I got it out of the creek this morning. I was late coming to school and I saw it kind of sparkle, so I picked it up and I ran to school with it." The guys all think it's neat. Well, the jeweler, he thought it was neat too. He said, could I take your pebble across to the jeweler store so I could put my special glasses on to look at jewels and see what kind of a stone this might be? Samuel agreed to that. And while he was still waiting for the jug of the vinegar to get full, the jeweler came running across the street and into that grocery store. And he said, Samuel, Samuel, come over to the jeweler's store. Well, Samuel had paid for his vinegar and he got that jug. It was heavy and he started carrying it over to the jeweler's shop. And the jeweler said, Samuel, this is a pearl, a real pearl. It's worth hundreds of dollars. I know a man in Chicago that's very wealthy. He will pay good money for this. I'm going to keep it for safekeeping here in my safe, and I'll contact that man in Chicago. Go home, Samuel, and tell your mother and father that their new farm is paid for. Hurry now. Well, Samuel, if he thought he flew to school that morning, he flew even faster going home. He ran past the school. He ran down that path that went to the creek. And once again, those poor frogs went boo, 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 out of that creek as he ran across. He didn't have time this time to pick up clamshells. He didn't have time to look at the bottom for good little pebbles. He just ran. And when he got home, he went into the dining room, and there sat Mother and Father. Mother was writing a letter to an orphanage. Well, you know what an orphanage is. An orphanage is where children have to go to live if they don't have parents anymore, or nobody can take care of them, or somebody dies. And Samuel looked over the shoulder of his mother, and she had written, Dear, and she had the name and the orphanage. She said, We have, and she was crying. Tears were running down her face. We have 6 children we no longer can care for. And Samuel went, Mom, Dad, you have the money now to buy the farm. We don't have to go to the orphanage. God's answered our prayers. And he told Mom and Dad all about that pearl, a pearl of great price that God had planted with the clamshells in that creek. Do you know that there was enough money to buy that little farm? And they lived there for 2 years. There was enough money for some cows and chickens, and they raised crops. And everything was going really well. And within 2 years, Father's sickness, with the medicine and the rest, went away. And the church members, oh yes, they had had somebody that filled in, but it wasn't like their pastor. And Pastor Jackman was able to go back and preach to his congregation again and take care of his church. And they still had the little farm. and they could live in the parsonage again. God had taken care of all of their needs. Remember, boys and girls, God is watching, and God knows when we need things, and He will take care of us. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week now. Bye-bye.